Hi, and now welcome to Chapter 5. We're looking at gender verbal communication and seeing the relationship between communication and gender. Now, I'm going to give you some ideas. This is coming from your textbook, so you can certainly go back there and have a look and see what was going through. And we're going to look at 3 sentences. The woman judge cast a deciding vote. Now, we'll see this quite frequently from time to time, at least, where we'll identify or highlight the sex or gender, saying that that particular woman, in this case, suggests that it's rather odd or unusual that she may in some way be a judge and that it's a woman, and so somehow that's not usual. And so we'll use it as a highlighting, or it's also known as spotlighting. Now, the second example, and I've heard this quite a bit actually in my profession as a behavior consultant when working with families, Jason babysat his son while his wife was attending a meeting. Now, the question comes to mind is, why do we use the term babysitting when referring to a father looking after their children? And yet we don't sort of say the same thing. Well, you know, Jason was at work, so Jill, his wife, was babysitting their children. So we start then to use language as a way of saying what's normal and not normal. It's not normal for a father to look after their children, therefore it must be babysitting. And then lastly, the freshmen find it difficult to adjust to college life. Well, the term freshman, now as much as it's so commonly used, it would suggest that this is all first students are in a all-male school. And of course, we use that term interchangeably with men and women. And as much as you would say, well, that doesn't mean the same thing as it once did, then why aren't we changing the language to reflect what we really mean? And so that's kind of where this chapter is going. We're going to look at and about the close relationship between communication and gender. Now remember, use your textbook, because the way I'm going to go through this is to highlight some of the points that break down this sort of communication cultures, if you will. And I want you to be able to look for more clarifications out of your textbook and some examples to make those explanations that I'm going to offer a little more clear. All right, so let's get on with this. So let's look at verbal communication as it's expressed cultural views of gender, and we'll look at some very key points, okay? So we're going to do this one looking at the cultural perspective. Language is one of our more complex symbol systems. We are, as humans, very dependent on the use of symbols, especially when it comes to the explanation of and the understanding and expression of our culture. Symbols allow us to define, they allow us to organize and to evaluate phenomena, things in our lives. Therefore, language helps us and is very important in defining gender. Language reflects and reinforces cultural views and cultural values. And we'll look at 6 connections between language and gender. And this is where I'm going to start going through these points one at a time, 1 through 6. But you'll find more clarifications in your textbook, so you should be using your textbook along with what I provide you in the videos. All right, so let's begin with the first one. That first, male generic language tends to exclude women. Now, male generic language like chairman, mailman, mankind, he, these are claims that include both sexes, as it seems to understand in our language. And yet research studies have shown people associate males only with the generic terms with much greater frequency than they would associate with females with them. So as much as we will say, well, that's meaning everybody, the research suggests that it doesn't become understood that way culturally in today's world as it maybe once did. So because of this evidence being provided by these studies, most dictionary and newspaper writing styles, when they have manuals for this now, have policies requiring inclusive language and warn against using male generic language. And you may find in some of the readings that you've done, certainly in this textbook, it's she's made an effort to try to do that throughout the textbook, is to make things more generic in the language that's used. So the first point is male generic language excludes women. Secondly, the second point, language defines men and women differently. Women are frequently defined by appearance or by relationships with others, while men are more often defined by activities, accomplishments, and positions. Language reflects social views of women as passive and men as active. For instance, phrases that suggest sexual activity imply that men are active and women are passive. Language reflects social views of women as defined by their relationships with others, instead of being independent agents or independent, individuals. For example, women do not marry have been viewed in Western society and Western culture as failures. We've used terms like spinster in the past, where men who are unmarried or don't marry until much later, we use different language that isn't quite as negative. Women are traditionally expected to change their names when they get married, while men are not. There are other options. For example, and we see this occurring more in the last 20 to 25, even 30 years, is hyphenating last names, creating a new last name. And there's even another approach, which is a matriarchal way. A matriarch is basically means ruled by mothers. Now, there's not a lot of cultures that follow that particular idea, but it values women. And so some choose to rename themselves based on the matriarchal lineage, and there's been examples of that in more recent years. Thirdly, language shapes awareness of gender issues. Language shapes awareness of what is important and helps us define realities. In addition, when someone is named like sexual harassment, or as in terms of date rape, it's easier to recognize it, to think about it, and then to stop it. It's not unlike the term stalking. At one point in our past, stalking wasn't a term that was used in our society in the way that it's used today. But by recognizing it and naming it, labeling it, if you will, and then being able to talk about it and make sense about what that was and the implications, it became something that we could put into law that would protect people from being stalked. But up until then, essentially the response was, well, until there's been a crime committed, we can't do anything about that. So language shapes our awarenesses of what are gender issues. Fourth, language organizes perceptions of gender. A stereotype is a generalization about a group based on, and often limited information, about some people who are part of that group. Stereotypes overlook individual characteristics and differences. So women are often stereotyped as overly emotional, weak, while men are often stereotyped as being rational and strong. Now, of course, we know that there are men and women that don't fit those stereotypes. And we recognize it more in men that they have more diversity than we often will do with women. Our language tends to create polarized thinking. The good, the bad, the right, the wrong, the blessed, the unblessed. We have so many variations of polarizing things. And this is looking at things as complete and distinct opposites. There doesn't appear to be an awful lot of gray area. So for instance, assuming something is either right or wrong, and there's no area in between, is a polarized example of thinking. The English language encourages polarized thinking by having few words that indicate the fine levels of distinction between here and here. We don't have a lot of words for this. Queer performative theory, well, it challenges the polarized thinking for sex and gender and gender sexual orientation. It encourages no polarization and looks for fluidity and individualism in the way that they describe gender and sexuality. Now the fifth, this is language evaluates gender. Now language frequently devalues females and femininity. Women are described as immature or juvenile, which identifies them, which we will use identifiers like girl and baby doll. You know, there's some terms in this particular chapter I won't say in video. Okay, so you'll find some of the other sort of descriptors in your chapter. Or we will equate them with, we'll equate women with food. We'll say things that will refer to them as sweet thing or sugar. Or even as animals, where we'll say chick. So we'll also use what we know as diminutive suffixes. Now these are designated to women in terms of reducing their form in relationship to the male standard. So you have major in terms of men, but you have majorette, bachelor, bachelorette. The suffix ETTE is what is the diminutive or diminutivization of women. They are a smaller or lesser than version of a man. Women are often blamed with language for the same behavior that are oftentimes celebrated with language for men. So when we look at the role of language that it plays, it's far more detailed and complex than the simple, sometimes misunderstandings that we make about what words mean and how they impact each gender differently. And finally, we'll look at language allows self-reflection. And that's an important part, because language allows us to use symbols to communicate. Language shapes how we think of ourselves, in addition, how we see the world around us. Meanings of language change over time. Either the way we label things, the way we understand things, or the way we communicate about things changes over time. For example, what is considered fat now might not have been considered the same in past times. We use different descriptors to describe people and how we will see as what is desirable now and what will be desirable in the future, or what's been desirable in the past changes. It doesn't remain the same, and language allows for self-reflection around, well, what does that mean to me now? What does that mean to me in the past? How might I want to think about this in the future? When we think in terms of another term that's used, androgyny is an alternative to the feminine masculine gender binary. It really means that you're either masculine or gender, but androgyny seems to fall somewhere in the middle. Androgynous people are both feminine and masculine. They carry both attributes or traits. Being androgynous behaviorally tends to relate to more professional success according to research. So when we look in terms of the self-reflective component of language, it allows us to think about who we are in relationship to other people and how other people can affect or do affect us in terms of society. Okay, now let's look at gender styles of verbal communication. Now, male people tend to be socialized in a masculine way, and all females tend to be socialized in a feminine way. And we're keeping this fairly binary now, I'm aware of that. Now this is not always the case, as it's important to remember that some people do not define themselves as male and female, masculine or feminine. However, there are general statements that we can make about about feminine and masculine around gendered communication, and that's what we're going to do now. So if we start with what is gendered speech communities, a speech community is a group of people who have common understandings and communication goals about how to reach those goals and interpretations of communication. Males and females tend to be socialized into masculine and feminine speech communities through games when we're children, and these gendered speech communities share communication practices and often underline underlie common misunderstandings or misinterpretations between members of different speech communities, masculine and feminine. As I mentioned, some of these happen early in the kinds of games we play as children. So the second point is lessons of children's play. Research have drawn connections between the way children play and how they communicate. These patterns seem to develop since children tend to play in same-sex segregated groups and play different kinds of games based on those groups. We'll begin with boys. Boys' games are often played in large groups and are competitive, have clear goals, include rough housing, and have distinct rules and roles within those games. They emphasize four main aspects of communication that cultivate competitiveness and individuality. One, they use communication to assert ideas and opinions and identity. Two, they communicate to achieve specific goals. Three, their communication is to get others' attention. And fourthly, they use communication to maintain control of that attention. Girls' games are often played in smaller groups or pairs and often do not have clear rules and roles. Players might talk about, might work out rules or talk about what kinds of parts they're playing. For instance, girls will often play house or school. There's emphasis on four main aspects of communication and that cultivate this interpersonal relationship. One, the use of communication to create sustained relationships. The use of communication to establish equity. Three, to use communication to include others. And four, that communication is showing caring. So the conclusion here is that girls tend to engage in more cooperative play, while boys engage in more instrumental, competitive play. These patterns tend to play out in adult communication as well. Thirdly, we can look at gendered communication practices. Feminine speech communities view communication as a tool for establishing and sustaining interpersonal relationships. Communication in feminine speech communities includes the following. It fosters connections, equalizes status, shows support for others. It includes conversational maintenance work that invites others to be part of the information with details, personal disclosures, and concrete details. Lastly, it's often tentative, such as using verbal hedges and tag questions. Now, some of the controversy associated with this surrounds the work done by Robin Latkoff, where he argues that hedges make women's speech powerless by indicating a lack of confidence. Now, however, Latkoff's argument relies on using masculine speech as the standard and interpreting feminine speech through a masculine lens. And so this notion around gender communication practices is that we don't necessarily use communication in exactly the same manner. The masculine speech community, well, it views communication as a way to establish goals, exert control, preserve independence, entertain, and enhance status. Communication in masculine speech communities can consider some of the following points. One, that it establishes status and control, that it uses communication to accomplish instrumental objectives. Instrumental, remember, is more about the doings. Gains and maintains conversational command. Interpretation is one characteristic like this. While both genders interpret, masculine communicators tend to do so more frequently. Masculine and feminine communication also differs in their reasons for interpreting. Masculine communication interprets to take control of a conversation, while feminine communicators interpret to indicate interest and respond to others. Masculine speech communities are also direct and assertive. They often abstract rather than are more personal. And they include minimum response cues, small verbal cues that one is paying attention, like yes and rather than specific responses, and they're less emotionally responsive. And so we'll see these differences in the feminine speech communities and masculine speech communities, and it helps us a bit understand where, when we start to engage in our older, in our later teens and adulthood, that we start to engage in communication more for intimate partnerships and marriages and relationships, that we find that communication isn't always straightforward and easy. The gendered linked language effect. Now, this is whether a person assumes a masculine or feminine style of speech is affected by a number of factors. This can include the topic, can include the speaker's status, the conversational partners, and the significance of gender to the conversation as a whole. So gender is not static, it's highly dynamic, and the extent to which communication reflects gender depends on the context and other features. Okay, and lastly, we're going to look at gender-based misunderstandings in communication, and probably you already have a pretty good idea that misunderstandings and misinterpretations occur a lot, and not just between genders. And so what we're going to look at here will be just in what way does gender speech communities and the way that masculine speech communities differ from feminine speech communities might affect some of these misunderstandings in terms of communication. And first one will be showing support. People who are in the feminine speech community often want to talk about a problem, while masculine communicators, they want to solve the problem. This often leaves both communicators feeling unsupported. Showing sympathy can be interpreted as condescending by the masculine community, but is seen as a way of showing support in more of the feminine community. Secondly, troubles talk. This is more about, masculine communicators tend to direct and are impersonal when communicating. Female communicators, they seek and give empathy and emotional support. This often leads to masculine communicators believing that feminine communicators are stage hogging, and feminine communicators thinking that masculine communicators are not understanding their problem. And so when we start to see these sort of experiences where the speech communities interact, there is some give and take, but there's also some misunderstandings based on the style of speech. The third point, 3, is the point of the story. Masculine communicators tend to tell a story in a linear way. Linear, chronological, a direct line. While feminine communicators tend to tell stories in a less structured, less organized format. They can meander and move around through a story and giving more detail. Masculine communicators often feel that the feminine communicators fail to move quickly to the point, feel that move to the point of the story, whereas feminine communicators often feel that the masculine communicators don't include important relationship information and relationship level detail. Fourthly, the relationship talk. Masculine communicators tend to talk about the relationship only when there's a problem, whereas feminine communicators, they tend to want to regularly check in about the state of the relationship. Masculine communicators may be nervous, annoyed, or otherwise dislike when the relationship partner wants to quote, talk about us, or when the relationship partner wants to talk about us, while the feminine communicator are confronted by such talk. they are ready to engage. And then lastly, public speaking. Masculine speaking style is generally the standard for public speaking. This means that feminine communicators are judged by the standard that are contrary to their own preferred manner of communication. And we see this a lot in politics and in corporate world, that the women who are CEOs or in politics will adopt a more masculine communication style, one, to be accepted and to be understood, and two, that seems to be the standard by which to communicate in a public way. So I'm hoping that, you know, these differing communication styles can lead to many, although they can lead to many misunderstandings, generally, people who can incorporate both feminine and masculine styles are seen as better communicators than those who exhibit only one style. So the moral of the story for this part of the chapter is to learn to adapt to and include in your own communication approach and style a bit of both the masculine and the feminine styles of communication speech. So next week, we'll start looking at the nonverbal communication and the role that it plays in understanding gender and the way we communicate. Thank you, everybody. Good luck, and we'll see you next week. 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. We're going to stop.